Thanks for joining me for the Pray for Micah podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review, and check out my YouTube channel and follow me on social media. Pray for Micah Pod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And now, on with the show.
Welcome to the Pray for Micah podcast. And now your host, Micah Kristin.
Hello, welcome to the Pray for Micah podcast, where we explore art, activism, spirituality, and our cosmic insignificance/significance. I'm here with Kristin Peterson. She's the author of Unruly Souls, the digital activism of Muslim and Christian feminists, a new book just released July 2022. And welcome, Kristin. Thanks for being on the show with me.
Great. Thanks, Micah.
I have to tell people that this is just a new podcast. This will be episode 19. So it's still a young child fledgling of a podcast. But for some reason, I felt kind of famous when I had an email from an author. Oh, this person's like legit. It's not like these spam bot things like,
yeah.
Oh, you have a podcast. You might be interested in promoting or doing something. I'm like, oh, this is a real person who has a book who's interested in activism, feminism, and you do digital media studies, which is what I studied in college. So I was like, what an exciting opportunity to get to meet you. So
yeah, exactly. No, the same thing happens to academics. We get a lot of very random emails, and every once in a while you're like, oh, this is something very relevant. This is great.
This is a real person. This is like a legit thing. And yeah. And congratulations on publishing. Yeah, I know that's a whole feat of itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. And I'm glad it's a good fit. I'm glad we found each other through the interwebs, as they say.
And we study digital media, so this is how people are going to do it now. You know, now you're over on the East Coast, you're in Boston. I'm in Kansas City, so here we are, still keeping true to the digital sphere post-pandemic. Just maybe one day when I'm rich and famous, I can like fly guests over, and do the whole thing, the shebang. But until then, I don't have any sponsors for the show, but I usually make up fake sponsors for each episode. I'm like, so the East Coast, hobglobbers, these people, I don't know, they're today's sponsor for today's show. One day I'll have real sponsors, maybe. I don't know, but I don't know. I've thought about doing Patreon. I haven't figured out that world yet, but right now I'm just like happy to do this and meet people and do it for free, because it's just, it helps me grow as a person, and it's like kind of part of my tagline. Like, I just interview various guests to learn how to become a better human. So
that's awesome.
So I bet this process of writing this book made you a better human. I bet this was whole like rigorous kind of soul searching, like with stuff with faith activism and your interest in digital media.
Yeah, and also I think I find it very inspiring in a lot of ways, because so much of the work, most of the book is focused on the work of young activists, and I find their work incredibly inspiring, and the way that they're able to do such important work, especially to in the case of the evangelical Christians, to really address very strong institutional concerns, and working against a very powerful culture to really bring out some of these issues that are going on. It was definitely not it's always difficult to write something, and especially difficult in the midst of a pandemic, but it was a good exercise, because the work was so inspiring. So it kept me going, to talk about this work that I think is really important. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I got a little sneak peek, kind of a digital PDF copy that, as I shared, I haven't been able to read the whole thing yet, just because we just met virtually a week or so ago. But what I appreciate, I think, just the initial premise or the vibe I'm getting from it is that this is a look at like people who are able to kind of critique the institutional faiths that they were brought up in, and challenge some of those maybe patriarchal and capitalistic ties to, how faith religions do, in this modern age. And they're doing it through digital media. But you could probably tell me more about that.
I think you're right. So I focused around this premise of, the book's called Unruly Souls, and partly that's, trying to be clever and in some ways, but I'm thinking of people who are sort of misfits in religious spaces, people who have been sort of designated as, you know, not part of the norm, right? If for whatever reason it might be. So it could be because of their sexuality, their gender identity. It could be because they're women, but they're not women in the way that they're supposed to be. They're not behaving in a particular pure, modest way. And also because of race, because of skin color, because of people's ethnic backgrounds, are deemed as inferior in religious spaces. And so for some of these individuals, it might simply be just who they are. There's nothing they can do about it. For some, it's a way that they're, you know, how their behavior, how they're living out their lives. But for whatever reason, these are people who have been sort of seen as not part of the norm, not given a voice. And what I was really focused on is how we can talk about, you know, the way that people are marginalized in society. And that's certainly really significant. But what I wanted to look at here is the way that people are marginalized within religious spaces and how that has an effect on people's sense of who they are, right? It's a deeper pain that happens when someone says, not just that you're not able to speak, but that you are created impure, you're created wrong, there's something wrong with you, and that you're sinful, you're inherently wrong and bad because of this. And that's where I was trying to get at, is like how that causes harm, and then how in these spaces individuals are working to rectify this. And so in some cases, I mean, I initially sort of started off thinking about how they're rectifying this in more of an activist sense of like, you know, if you think about Church Too or the Mosque Me Too movement, which are, as you can assume, they're kind of Me Too movements within Christianity and Islam. And these movements are certainly very powerful, right? We're seeing now like the stuff that's going on within the SBC church. We're seeing, you know, movements within, there's other things that have happened within Islam to address abuse within those communities. But then I was thinking about how moving beyond that, moving beyond just this initial activism, but also thinking about, because this is such a spiritual harm, how people are using digital media to also find community, to find support, and to ultimately kind of create something new, right? To create a new space where they can explore, like what you do on your podcast, explore faith, and really center on these marginal experiences, right? So rather than say you're impure, you're a misfit, but rather to say, what does it mean to center, to create Christianity, to create a version of Islam that is built on queerness, or is built on feminine nature, is built on Blackness, right? Like to really not just say, oh, you're accepted, but to actually center that and build something out of that. So that's really, I guess, where I ended up in terms of the book, in terms of the conclusion of saying that it's not just this activism work, which is really important, and this critique, but it's also this work to actually create a new faith experience.
Oh, that's beautiful. And it's coming at, like, you know, obviously it's always a pivotal time, but, you know, when we kind of were chatting about just the movements that have been happening since Ferguson, and just the conglomeration of how we're using our social movements and how it ties into like social movements, and just the impotence of, or having Trump in the office, and how much I think every faith as a whole, like religious group, is having some kind of major shift. Like you're saying, like they have to now, they can't just ignore these issues, or like they have been in like the 80s and 90s. Like we're just going to pretend these people don't exist, and they're being forced to, like, I think specifically after George Floyd too, a lot of churches, a lot of faith communities were like, okay, like we have to say something about racial disparities in our country. And it's unfortunate it takes some kind of pivotal social like moment, like around someone's death in their life, to create that kind of introspection in a faith community. But it is what it is. Like it's how it was when Emmett Till died, you know, or was killed, murdered, you know, like throughout history, there's just been these moments where
yeah. And I also think there's a generational shift. So you have people the book looks at Christianity, mostly evangelical Christianity, and Islam in the US context. And so they're different contexts, but there's similarities, and I try to get at that. And I think you have the younger generation within American Islam, mostly individuals who were born in the US or were maybe born somewhere else but raised here. Or you have, African-American converts or children of converts or grandchildren of converts. And so you have these young people who have been raised in the US context and are calling for reform within the Muslim community around women's rights, around sexuality, around anti-Blackness mainly. And then you have within evangelical Christianity a movement of young people who are raised within purity culture, the 90s, early 2000s, very conservative political, that they're raised in a community where everything is about politics, and politics is, anti-abortion, anti-gay rights, right? And so they're coming to become 20s and 30s and coming to be adults, and they're starting to say this is not what the faith is about, right? So you have kind of these two different movements happening within these religious traditions, I think, really coming out of
give me just 1 second. My vacuum robot is angry at me. He's done charging, so he wants to be turned off. Hold on just 1 second. Some friends sold me one of these little Roomba things.
Oh yeah, we have one too.
And it's made a big difference with my pets and all the animal hair everywhere.
Yeah.
But some reason when it's done charging, it just wants to beep angrily for like 5 minutes and it will not stop. And so it's like, okay, all right, I'll come shut you off. I had to have a whole conversation with my pets when I brought him in. I'm like, this is DJ, like DJ Roomba from Parks and Rec. And I'm just like, he is one of us. And
yeah, I know dogs do not like them. They just stare at them, and
right.
I know. but yeah, anyway, so as I would say, so I think you have these two distinct movements happening, but really based on these generational shifts that you see of these newer generations coming up and sort of saying that this is not really what they see for their faith. And so for some people, they're just leaving the religions completely. And some people are trying to reform the religions from within, and others are kind of creating something new. But you're seeing a lot of different movement happening. And so I think there's that as well. So you have the larger social movement happening, but I also think it's the generational shift, right, that's happening as well.
Absolutely. And kind of hearing more about your journey of just studying communications.
Yeah.
You went to Boulder. And so what kind of spurred, like, was it during that time and like your I guess, did you do your undergraduate there or did you do your PhD studies?
Sure. Yeah. I gave you a little background. So I did my undergraduate school called Dominican University, which is just outside of Chicago. It's a very small liberal arts Catholic school. And I studied journalism. And then I did some work and did public relations, communication, journalism work for a bit. And then I was most interested in doing like religion reporting. I mean, back before when I got my undergrad, it was like right around the time when newspapers sort of crumbled, right in the midst of the crisis of newspapers. And my really goal was like, I would love to have been like a religion reporter, like to work for a newspaper and write about religion. Because that's just always been my interest in life. One of the things I've been fascinated by is religious experiences. So I decided I wanted to go back and get a master's in religious studies because even though I was interested in it, I didn't actually feel like I had a good background in religious history. And so I did that and got a pretty good background in sort of American religious history and traditions. And then I decided the better approach I felt in terms of theory was to look at it from the angle of media and communication. And so then there's a program at University of Colorado at Boulder that really focuses on media and religion. So not official, but there's a research center there that researches media and religion. And working with Stuart Hoover, who's kind of one of the key figures who started back in the 80s to study televangelism as it was emerging. He was one of the first people to say, like, let's study this, right? Let's look at what's going on, how people are engaging with this, how they're using this in their lives to make meaning. And so anyway, so I worked there, did my PhD in media studies, and and so then really focusing in on this intersection with media and religion. And most of my research and my PhD dissertation looked at Muslim Americans and the way that they use digital media to counteract stereotypes. So around that time, I mean, that was a big, period with Trumpism and, anti-Islamic rhetoric. So there was a lot going on in terms of that. But then kind of coming out of that experience and merging into this new project, I wanted to move away from the sort of this idea of like Muslims kind of counteracting stereotypes and more look at the creativity among Muslims in terms of how they're, especially the younger generations, not just counteracting stereotypes, but actually just creating their own things, right? And not getting out of this kind of conversation where they're always responding and always reacting.
Right.
And so thinking about how a lot of young creative Muslims are doing a lot of work, like to just think in a completely new way. So the really, really cool project that's part of the book is the Mipsters project, which began as just a silly fashion video in 2013. But when did they release this? 2021, I believe. They released this whole project, like a multimedia project. It had a video, and they also have a lot of artwork. And I think they have an art show going on right now at, I want to say Duke or UNC, one of those two. And just really cool stuff where they're thinking about Muslim futurism. So I don't know if you're familiar with Afrofuturism.
A little bit,
kind of building on that, of like thinking about how do we imagine a future, and how do we imagine a future that thinks outside of like white supremacy and kind of a colonized idea, and sort of how do we think about what it means to be Muslim if we're not basing it in all these categories and labels that have kind of held us down for so long. So anyway, I kind of went on a long tangent with that, but
that's what I'm here for.
That's basically like sort of how I got to where I'm at. So yeah, I mean, I think when you do research, there's a lot of times where you get really into something and you find something super interesting and then you write a bunch about it and then you're like, I'm done with this. Or you're like,
take a break. Yeah.
Or you're just like, I feel like I've sort of, done this so much that there's nothing more to say, or things change, and that was the thing I found, is that there was a lot that changed, particularly entering grad school before Trump and then leaving. In the midst of that, there was a lot that happened if you're studying Islam in the US. So that's kind of where I ended up. And now I'm at Boston College. This is my 5th year. And I teach digital media courses, social media, media ethics, but then I also teach media and religion courses. So I teach one course that kind of does more of a historical look at how media and religion are related in US society. And then I do one that's more digital, contemporary examples of religion and spirituality. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah. It's interesting that you're talking about, just like you were sharing about how folks in Muslim community, how they have to, especially in the US context, have to always kind of react to what's happening in culture. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like before 9/11, they lived wonderfully around people, and then suddenly, they're under the spotlight, and suddenly they're not white. Like, it's suddenly, they were doctors. I mean, they still are. It doesn't matter what position you hold that makes people feel better around you, but it's just like, people who you worked with all these years, suddenly everyone's looking at you side-eyed like, wait, are you this or that, And I have a friend who came on my show. Her name's Layla Zaidi, and she's Pakistani American, and her family and immigrated here and when she was younger, and she shares kind of like, just the interesting, like the times that her basically her faith community had to like put out a statement to kind of like decry whatever violent or thing that happened in the news or something that had related to things, and just like, why is the onus put on them?
Right.
That never happens to white supremacist, or Christian dominant culture, where like, this white supremacist who's a Christian went and shot these people. We never have churches. Like, that is not part of our faith community. That's not
right.
But it's something that they other communities that it's expected of them for some reason to have to react to what culture is like. Make sure you have to say, even if you didn't do it, you're saying sorry for what happened on behalf of your faith community, and it's just absurd.
Yeah, and like a lot of younger Muslims have kind of come to the point of like, we're not doing that anymore. Like, we're just not going to do that. Like, we're going to create art and create things that speak to our experiences. And we're not going to be continuing to respond to that. Like the Mipsters, the representatives from them, the two people kind of who serve as kind of the spokespeople for that group, they talk about in the book, like this idea that, you know, we're not going to continue to sort of prove that we're this safe, you know, Muslim neighbors, you know, and that we're these American good Muslims, right? And I think that's really great the way. And if you look at media representations of Muslims, you can kind of see this trajectory where at first you sort of have, you know, the good Muslim character who's like helping fight terrorism, right? It's still like connected to terrorism.
Right.
And then you start to have more of like funny representations. And now you have something like the show Rami. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but that's a really great show because it's just saying like, yeah, we're Muslim, but that's not like the focus of the show. Like there's so many other issues that the show brings up and struggles. And it talks about, you know, faith struggles and struggles of being a 20-some-year-old person and dealing with relationships and family and all these different things. And I think that's the direction it's heading, which I think is great, you know, that it's moving beyond just this proving that you're human and moving more into, you know, exploring various aspects of people's lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. And something you mentioned earlier, and I want to delve more into it, like just what are the parallels and intersections you see between Christian and Muslim activists and what they're dealing with. But my friend Layla, you know, when we were recording, we're sharing a lot of similar, again, like kind of totally different faith experiences. I mean, again, it's tied to the whole Judeo, you know, kind of region, as you would say. So then you like realize like, oh yeah, we're actually have a lot of similar faith-based stories of like, you know, that's tied to the Bible or different things. But it was just interesting hearing from her perspective. Like, again, she grew up in Joplin, Missouri her whole life. So again, she, you know, has a very, you know, just, you know, she's obviously a woman of color, but just, you know, Missouri accent, you know, that kind of experience. But, and then just sharing about how it just was very interesting. Like me growing up evangelical, her growing up in a household, how like, you know, the same kind of parallels with dealing with sexism or, you know, the things that we now look back at our faith and we realize, you know, our faith experience. And we're like, oh, we were dealing with a lot of the same bullshit, you know, kind of deal.
Right. Yeah. The one thing that's interesting is there's this whole thing in purity culture of like object lessons where you have like a flower and you peel all the petals off and say like, oh, this is what you'll be like if you have sex before you're married. Like nobody wants to be with you anymore. And, you know, chewing up a piece of gum or whatever. And they have the same things in Islam, which is interesting. They have similar kind of object lessons. So I thought that was one interesting, actually, that was one of the first interesting connections I found. And so definitely like modesty culture. It's very similar in both, but it takes on different forms. So obviously within Islam, there's more of a focus on dress, like there's specific types of dress, but then within Christianity, there's also, you know, a focus on being modest and, you know, and you hear very similar things of like, don't wear things that are going to tempt men or gonna, you know, like men are weak. And so like in Islam, it's this idea of like, oh, well, like the women need to pray in a different space because they'll be distracting to men. And then in Islam, in Christianity, you hear, you know, like, well, don't wear certain things that are going to be tempting to men. So there's that. And then definitely just sexual abuse and domestic violence and some of these issues that happen within the communities. There's, you know, I think every institution has these problems. Islam has more of a challenge in some ways because it is less of an institutional structure. So there isn't like a way to kind of go and address like people who are abusive and to sort of, you know what I'm saying? Like there is less of a structure for that. And sometimes within evangelical Christianity, obviously there isn't either if it's more of like independent churches. So anyway, so there's those concerns. And then racism as well exists in both spaces. It's different in both spaces, but certainly within Islam, there's a lot of anti-Blackness and colorism that goes on, and a similar kind of idea that somehow those who are not white or light complected are less holy than others, right? And so there's a similar kind of ideas in that sense as well. And then homophobia as well. There's similar
right. That was something else
teachings.
we talked about too. Just those parallels of homophobia in our faith experiences.
Yeah.
And we also kind of share just the construct of hell and what it means to be a good Christian and be a good Muslim, and like if you don't follow these tenets of the faith, you're gonna potentially go to this bad place. And it sounds like both of our families have kind of come to accept us now as our young adult selves and our faith thing. And I think her quote was, her dad, somebody said, basically like, you're a good human, Layla, and that makes you a good Muslim, even if you don't observe, going to the mosque and prayers or whatever.
Yeah. And there's definitely distinctions, because I think with evangelical Christianity, there's obviously like the power structure and the fact that it's so close to American political power, and that there's an entire subculture, right, that people talk about, where there's an entire culture around books and music and TV shows and movies and all of that is created within that community to reinforce these ideas. And then within Islam, you have the other aspect of anti-Islamic rhetoric within the US context and the political situation. So there's definitely distinctions, but I think among young people, there's a lot of similarities in their experiences.
Yeah. So let's do it, Kristin. I want to delve into where are you at in your spiritual walk, your faith kind of beliefs? Like, I know you said it's been interest. You wanted to do reporting on it. And so I'm assuming you grew up evangelical
no,
Christian.
Actually, I didn't.
Okay. Well, there you go. See, that's it. You don't go assuming things. So
yeah,
tell me a bit about your faith journey.
I'm Catholic, practicing Catholic, grew up Catholic. Okay. Yeah, I know, surprise. But but I went to public schools and went to evangelical youth group stuff in high school. I don't know I think it was called like Arise. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but it was like before school. We would like go to like we had like meetings before school, and we would sing songs and whatever. And I have a distinct memory of being there in high school, and two distinct memories I have. One is there was one of the girls' fathers was a pastor, and he came in and gave like a preaching, because we would usually do like singing and then we would have like a preaching thing. And I remember him preaching about being gay was like a sin and terrible, or I don't even really remember. But I remember thinking, I was probably like 15. I remember thinking like, I don't really think that makes a lot of sense to me. Like that doesn't really make sense to my understanding of like God and what God would say. And then I do remember having a conversation with a friend who was evangelical and went to that church, and she made some comment about Catholics not being Christian. I remember being like, what? Like, what are you talking about?
That was how I grew up. Yeah. The Catholics are close, but
so confused, because I was like, I go to this group with you. So I had that experience. And then, and that was interesting because I was going to like Catholics, catechism and Catholic church. And then I liked going to the youth group because it was like good music and stuff. But like I said, I had that moment where I was like, I don't really think I agree with this. Like I think it just seemed overly simple, like overly simplified to just dismiss being gay as a sin. And I did just in general found it to be very simple. And then in college, I had a friend who was Pentecostal, and she took me to her church one night, and it was like honestly one of the most impactful things that ever happened to me, because I had a friend in high school who was Pentecostal, and all I knew was that she had to have long hair and she couldn't watch TV and she had to wear skirts, but I didn't know anything about what the church was like. So I went to my friend's church, and it was like really wild because everyone was like talking in tongues and running around. And I was like, what is happening, you know? And it was a whole youth thing about purity. And we did like a purity pledge and we signed these cards. I didn't know what any of this was. It was
Kissed
really
Dating Goodbye. Did you have
yeah,
to
it
read that
wasn't that.
book?
It wasn't
Okay.
that book, but I never did read that book. But we had a purity pledge, and I think it was something about like true love waits or something. It was one of those ones.
Yep. I read that
Yeah,
one.
I'm worth the wait or something. I remember that, and that was just really like very impactful because I never experienced anything like that, and so that was something that was really had an I really remember that, and yeah, and I had a purity ring that someone had given me. And so I was a bit immersed in that, but not so much because I went to Catholic school and or Catholic church. We didn't really get a lot of that. So those were a lot of the intersections I had when I was doing this project. And I was remembering some of these things that I experienced when I was younger. And just remembering those feelings where I just felt like that what I learned in my understanding of God was very different from the way I was what I was hearing, right? That it was very overly simplified, I felt like. And then it's funny because I had that experience and then I was really fascinated by the experience of religion that I saw there, of the Pentecostal service. Like I remember it was like, the floor was shaking and it was just like very fascinating to me to see this. And so that was kind of where I started to say, I think I want to do more about this and study more of this. And I ended up going into doing journalism in college and did a study abroad program in London. And I did a project where I went around to all of these Pentecostal churches in London, but they were mostly either African or Afro-Caribbean communities. And that was really, really fascinating to observe and to see their practices and the way that they existed as this very outgoing expression of faith within a very reserved, Church of England tradition, like within England, right? Obviously they were Pentecostal. Right. Anyway, so going on a long story, but that was kind of how I ended up getting into that in terms of my research. I just was really fascinated by the variety of ways people experience religion. And yeah, so that's a bit of that. But then in terms of my faith tradition, I mean, I think I went to a very progressive university that had a lot of Dominican sisters who are very inspirational in the way that they live their lives and their focus on justice. And so I really embraced that. And in college, I did a lot of like service trips and social activist trips and doing work in the city of Chicago. And it really was inspirational to me. And I did the Jesuit Volunteer Corps after college, which is kind of like the Peace Corps, but it's the Catholic version of it. And so I just feel like I sort of settled on a faith that really integrates justice and equality and this radical love for the marginalized. So that's really where I feel like I've fallen in terms of my faith, is just in that sense. I think of like a radical love for all people, right? And really building on the idea that Jesus was amongst the marginal, the outcasts, and really that is where you find Jesus in that sense and find God. Yeah, I just read this really good piece. Maybe you've seen it. It was in the Washington Post. It was a pretty long piece looking at critiquing Christian nationalism, right? And critiquing it from the perspective of, if you look at the gospel and if you look at Jesus, like Jesus stands on the opposite of Christian nationalism, right? That he was among those who were weak and powerless and and speaks for those people and doesn't speak for people who are, I mean, Christian nationalism, in my view, is all about power, right? It's all about being in control. So anyway, so that's kind of where I would find my faith, is in that sense. But I think because I've had these kind of intersections with evangelicalism, I think that was a bit of where I was interested in that, when I started to see like, oh yeah, I remember some of these experiences I had when I was a kid. And
yeah, it's funny. I grew up going to a non-denominational church, but we did exactly those things. We spoke in tongues, believed in healing and miracles, casting out demons. And it's just an interesting thing looking back and reflecting on, like, I don't know how to describe it. I don't, and my whole thing is whatever faith construct helps you move towards loving people and creating inclusive communities. So to each their own. If praying in tongues and doing that stuff is fine, but it's just interesting. Like now that I'm distant from that and like looking back, and I'm kind of trying to rationalize my head, was it like this kind of group psychosis thing that I was kind of going on? What kind of it's just amazing. I think I don't know. That's why I consider myself still kind of like a mystic in that sense. Like I think the divine is kind of too large for us to even conceptualize or to put into words. And so it's just interesting how psychology and our brains and neurofunctions, how something magical could be happening just even from a naturalistic sense that we can't explain.
Right. No, I totally agree. And like, I don't mean to come off as judgmental, because honestly, it was more like in that experience when I was very young, I had never experienced anything like that before. But after that, growing out of that, it was like, oh, this is so fascinating that people have these experiences. And definitely, I mean, you probably know, like in the Pentecostal tradition, it was created amongst poor white and non-white people, right? That there's a huge influence of Black members in the church, and I think those kind of spiritual experiences helped people, particularly people who are marginalized, to find a connection to God that they weren't finding in the sort of static spaces of traditional churches. But yeah, so I don't mean to sound critical in that way. It was more just at that point I was like, I never experienced something, and then I was like fascinated by that, and I wanted to, delve more into those experiences.
Yeah, and you weren't sounding critical either, but I think the other thing is it's okay to judge the judgmental aspects, the judging, like you're saying, like it's interesting because again, it always feels like it felt like a free flowing, like let the spirit lead, like and in that atmosphere, how there was all this sub layer of control of like it was just an interesting juxtaposition. I felt like there's this free spirit, kind of like let the spirit move, and you could move and kind of dance or do things, but you better have, your clothes and your hair and all this regulated outward appearance stuff. And so it's just interesting that, now when I'm in my hippie groups, that's my new expression, doing all the flow art and doing different things. Like, okay, I've kind of found my new church community where we do this kind of weird, flow stuff. But so as you were saying, kind of with your faith, it's tied more to the social justice and aspects of it. And so, and I feel like there's such an interesting, I've met with pastors, former, friends and people I know from my past who kind of wanted to meet with me and pick my brain, so to speak, as they would say, about like critical race theory and just wanting to like understand. I don't know. I think maybe they were just like, Micah's in that world. He's a safe person to go talk to about it. And just interesting having these conversations where, I'm basically trying to use as much as I can of like relatable church speak that I still have. Like, like when we look at like these sins that, Jesus is like, with the woman at the well, where he's like bridging that gap between, Samaritan woman and Judy, him being a Jew, and just showing like, hey, like I'm not here to judge that person either, and this and that. And so I don't know, they're on board with it as far as like, yes, we shouldn't be racist, and yes, we should like do a better job of, not perpetuating racism in our culture. But what about sexual sins, and what about these other sins? And I just felt like I had to keep directing them back. I'm like, that might be something that you feel like you have to talk to your congregation about. But you can't just say like, okay, we're going to focus on these things and not talk about, anti-racism work, because it's part of woke culture and it's part of this liberal agenda. And I don't know, I told him, like, go read the Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr., like where he's talking to other white clergy and like tell him like, what the hell are you doing, basically. So, you're always saying wait till when it's the right time, or telling Black folks to keep waiting. And it's like, this should be the time when the church should be rising up to speak out against these things because of how clear the injustice is and how Christ wouldn't stand for it.
Right. Yeah.
And so I'm curious, like, in your world, since you've written this book, I don't know how much you still engage directly with faith communities, but do you feel like folks, you're trying to like highlight these broader systemic social issues that I think, again, tied to like the greater, more impactful sins of our time, and they're like, no, but let's focus on this other stuff,
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this exactly answers it, but I do feel like with racism, what I've seen is that within evangelical churches or Christian churches, there's this idea that it's like an individual problem or an issue that's not really that big of an issue. It's like, well, we let Black people into our churches and it's not a big deal. Who cares? But I think I look at the podcast Truth's Table, which I don't know if you've listened to that, but it's an excellent podcast. It's hosted by 3 Black Christian women, and they all have theological training and have really more knowledge than I would ever have about the Bible and all these different traditions. And they talk about, this is a fundamental human problem, right? This is a human sin. And this is, now I'm Catholic, so I'm not as familiar with Calvinism, but thinking about this is a great, what's the word? What's the kind of big Calvinist idea? I'm blanking my head about it right now.
Like predestination.
Depravity, right? So this idea that this is humans are created depraved, right? This is a Calvinistic idea, right? And so they talk about how, racism is part of human depravity. It's part of, human sinfulness, right? And if it's not looked at in that way, then there's, if it's just sort of seen as like a little minor problem that we can address, then that's, that they call for this entire reparations in a spiritual sense, right? That there's a need to right these wrongs that have been done. And so it's not just about like, let's all hold hands, but it's actually about like addressing that there's a radical problem that at the root of Christianity, American Christianity. And so I think that's one of the areas I think is significant when you're looking at addressing racism. And so that comes into play when you look at the fact that it's not just saying, oh yeah, like we're welcome and we have, we welcome Black people and we have this great diverse community, but it's actually a radical thing of having, a Black, an image of Jesus as with Black skin, right? With dark skin, right?
Absolutely.
It's like incorporating these things to actually tell people that God, that this is when you have this long tradition of reinforcing that the divinity is white, goodness is white, sin, being pure is white, then it's really hard for people's ontology to say that this person that's sitting next to you, sure, they're welcome at the church, but they're radically equal to you, right? That they are just as created in God's image as you are, right? And that's because, you have such a long tradition of the opposite being true, right? And so I think this podcast does a good job of really focusing on the personal experience of that, right?
Tell me the name one more time. I'm gonna have to check them out.
Truth's Table.
Truth's Table.
Yeah, it's a pretty prominent podcast, and it's really great. And like I said, for me, from a Catholic perspective, I mean, I've studied Protestant theology and history in the U.S., but a lot of the stuff, it's like over my head in terms of the theology because I'm not as familiar with it. But it's a really great podcast.
Yeah, and I'm kind of in the camp of I could care less about Calvinism and all that bullshit, but again, like you're saying, not to judge people's faith experience, and then like especially if it's women of color leading, like I understand your truth and what you're trying to do with it, like make a difference in your community, and if that faith language and arguing with people on that front helps you do that, cool.
I think it's like Protestant Calvinism, Puritan ideas, I feel like they've influenced American religion in so many ways. So so that's just part of it. But I don't know if that really answered exactly your question, but
related
to it.
A funny I saw this funny meme one time that was, you know, it said Calvinism, no lives matter.
Yeah.
Just like,
yeah, well,
that's what it comes down to. I mean, when it's like God decides who gets to go to heaven and who goes to hell for all eternity. So it doesn't matter who if we preach it or not. And it's just like,
yeah, it
no
doesn't
lives
matter.
matter.
So a funny story is when I was a TA for a religious studies course, it was religions in the US, and we spent all this time learning about, the Puritans and John Calvin and predestination and all these things. And then we did like site visits where we'd go, to all these different types of religious communities. It was really great. And we took them to a Presbyterian church. And one of the students, we sat down with the pastor afterwards, and one of the students was like, "Can you tell me about predestination and what you think about it? And, you still believe in this, right?" And he was like, It was funny. It was like, they were all ready for it. Like, "Oh, you all still believe in this John Calvin stuff."
I just find it fascinating that like this idea of free will versus determinism, like it plays out in science all the time. And I find that the most fascinating aspect. Like, I guess Albert Einstein for the longest time was deterministic. Like, he really thought the universe was just a series of domino effects. And so the fact that he existed and was studying and doing these things, he believed that it was like
interesting.
It was, and I guess like, I'd have to do some more research. I could just, again, take anything I say with a grain of salt and do your own research, people, but apparently it was the study, like just before they even discovered subatomic particles, just looking at the math of subatomic and the probabilities of like how, their movement can be like basically unpredictable and disappear and reemerge and appear. That caused him to question the idea of like a deterministic universe where how can something come out of nothing,
That's
and
fascinating.
it was not till years later that we started actually verifying the math, the science behind subatomic particles to like, and doing actually observe I don't know. I just find all that interesting. The observation of the split experiment. Have you heard any of that?
No, but I just think the intersection between religion and science, I always find that so fascinating, especially like when you look back at like history and these different developments of science and technology and how religion was often really strongly implicated in those. That's a whole nother thing, but yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think happens when we die, Kristin? Just like, let's go to the deep. I'm just curious, like, what do you think happens after we die?
Oh boy. I don't know. I think of it in the same way as you think of when a baby's in utero and they don't know, like they're comforted. They feel like this is like the best that there can be. And then they don't know of like life after that. I think of it in that way, but I don't really know. I mean, I feel like it's the sense of like, we don't know what it will be. I think of the fact that, we get into gender and stuff. And I think about the fact that you have, this conception of God is masculine, right? And I think of like how we know that there's no possible way that God is human in that way, right?
Yeah.
But our mind can't really, like, we know that, but we still can't really break out of that. So I feel like in that way, like I feel like there's so much we can't actually understand. I don't know if that it doesn't really answer your questions.
Oh no, it totally does.
It's more like I think of it in that way. I think of like there's so much that we can't understand about the divine, and so I just feel like there's no way that we could possibly understand it. But I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I heard something the other day that was just kind of an interesting perspective. Again, I joke and I tell people there's some days I wake up and I feel like I could sneeze and I'd be an atheist, and other days where there's just this constant kind of tug at my heart towards this longing towards being connected to something greater than ourselves. And it was just an interesting thing I heard on one of the shows or things I watched. They were talking about how how can we know if the universe itself, all that exists, is some level conscious, right? And just kind of the metaphor of our own bodies, like my lungs have a rudimentary conscience as far or conscientious of its, it doesn't have self-reflection. It's not like, why do I exist in Micah's body? But it's tied to this organism that is conscious, and so it's just an interesting. And so because the universe has conscious beings within it,
right,
it itself could then be potentially conscious, even if it is made up of all these unconscious, dead planets and rock, whatever we want to. And there's also we're humans, we don't understand what consciousness completely is. We think it's tied to the brain and to the nervous system and different things, but it was just an interesting perspective of like, so like if God really is this huge, just again, maybe it's a turtle with a rock, the whole universe is sitting on its back. It's like, it would be a conscious being because there's elements of consciousness within it. I don't know. I find it.
I don't know. Yeah. I once did this like reading group this was a while back, but it was like people from a church that I was involved with. And I was by far the youngest person in this group, and it was mostly people who were like 60s and older. And we read all this stuff about cosmology, and it was just like blew my mind, like some of this stuff. And I find that, again, it's like we can't understand the universe. We can't understand that. And there's just so many things we can't understand that I just feel like, whatever happens when we die is greater than that. And I guess we just have to have faith in what it says in the teachings, that there's a kingdom, a greater place, a greater, where humans will be, I don't know, a place of love. And that's all I can think of. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I also have these other scary thoughts, half the time it's Neil deGrasse Tyson who gives me these, cosmological big, unsettling thoughts. But basically because of like Hawking radiation, which is like, they discovered that basically black holes have, it kind of spews out kind of these residual like radiation from within the black hole, and there's ways to like use that to measure it, and they've been, it's been proven. It's like Hawking radiation's a thing, and so theoretically, they think, again, it might be centuries before we actually study a black hole in any kind of meaningful, probe, viewing way. But this idea that because light can't escape it, and so if you were to fall into it, you would look like you freeze in time to the viewers who look at you. And so in many ways they think that all that exists that has passed through into the event horizon in the black hole, there's basically almost like a vibrational memory of all that has ever existed, that not all that is, but anything that that has gone into it. There's like a record of it, so to speak. And so the weird thought could be that somehow we, humanity, everything, we're living out a vibrational record memory right now. Maybe we've passed through a black hole in some other universe, and that was like the Big Bang. There's theories that the Big Bang was like us on the event, past the event horizon. And I don't know, it's just trippy thinking about how all that record could be there, and maybe we're living out some kind of vibrational memory, and that's where you get like maybe reincarnation or these other things that like maybe it's all true in the end. Like it's all part of it, like
no, it's super fascinating. I'm not an expert on it though.
You're like, I'm a professor of media, so I will not touch that. So I go down those rabbit holes of, watching those videos of different things and bastardize explaining it and talking to other people. And it's just funny. I don't know. I do that with the same thing with dinosaurs, and just like, can you believe the eons and this and that and this existed or whatever. And half the time they're like, yeah, Micah, we know because we went to public school. Just like, 'cause
Yeah.
I was homeschooled, so a lot of my friends just give me shit and be like, well, yeah, if you went to public school, you would have learned about evolution, like not creationist theology, or science. So
it's funny.
So what's the next step for kind of now that you've published this book? I know like you're teaching and like you're part of your role in kind of advancing this justice work through literally training the next generation of activists. But like, are you doing any public speaking engagements? Do you go to churches, or like, what are your thoughts about
I mean, if you have ideas, that would be great. I mean, I'm just trying to spread the word and sending it to people who are involved in the project. So a lot of people in like the former evangelical movement, the Church 2 movement, some of these projects within the Muslim community, the Mipsters movement, some of the people that are in the book. So spreading the book, it's funny. Academic publishing is a little bit silly because you publish the book and then it's like the publishing of the book is the hard part, and then you kind of like, okay, it's done, it's in the world. It's a little bit strange, but
are you gonna go to conferences? Like
I do conferences, and I'm gonna do maybe a talk on campus here and a talk where I went to college. So just doing a couple things like that, and just doing stuff like this, spreading the word, kind of, because I like for people, especially people who are in that community, to read this book and hear about these experiences. And I would, like I said, I think the work that's being done in the book is really, really important. So spreading the word about that. And then, just academic life keeps chugging along, and always working on some other project. So kind of shifting into new directions. I've always been doing a lot of work on influencers and social media. And so I'm doing some more work on those projects. And I think I'm going to do a new project on kind of looking at contemporary sort of spiritual figures online, particularly women, and they're kind of quote unquote spiritual leaders, but people who've kind of created followings around podcasts and Instagram and these spaces. And there's a lot of like wellness influencers and spiritual kind of life coaches, self-care. And I've grown interested in that and kind of wanting to look a little bit at how that relates to past experiences of women who've taken on leadership roles within religious communities and claimed kind of spiritual authority or religious authority. So that's hopefully the next project. But that's where things are going right now.
Yeah. I was just going to say, in some ways it's really refreshing to hear your perspective of somebody who is trying to connect these dots where people can still maintain some semblance of their childhood faith and connect it to the issues at hand. I'm curious, was there ever a moment while you were writing this book, or just kind of in your studies in general of religious studies, where, there's definitely a larger portion of population that's just migrating towards, not even atheism, but just non-religious or spiritual. And so curious what your thoughts are, like the arguments for folks who are like, oh, just the whole thing needs to just die, or the church, like religious, whatever institution just. And so I'm curious, like, I mean, even I guess at the end of the day, we know that even if it was like we woke up tomorrow and the whole, Islam construct is gone and Christianity construct, people would just form other religious practices in place of that. So I guess I'm just curious, like, what your thoughts are, like, how much do we save of the old to bring it in with the new? And
well, it's funny because I think institutions always bring problems, right? You get people together, you create an institution, there's problems. So we're seeing that, I think it was, in 2005 or so, when the Catholic sex abuse crisis became the story. It was kind of like, oh, it's the Catholic Church because of X, Y, and Z. These are the reasons why. But then you say, well, there's abuse that happened within the Boy Scouts. There's abuse that happens now. We're looking at the SBC, abuse that happens within all these different institutions. So institutions always have problems. There's always corruption. There's always abuse. So that's a concern. But I think the thing is, it's like when you get people together, people are sinful. People are going to do things like that. And so I'm just hesitant to eliminate religions or eliminate communities, religious communities, because there's a need to be in community with people, and there's a need to struggle through these things, right, together. And I'm a little bit, and I don't want to be like generational judging other generations, but I'm a little concerned in the sense that like a lot of younger people rightly are leaving institutions and are trying to find their own path in all these different ways. And I think it's so great the way that people are exploring and engaging with spirituality. But I just worry because you need to be in a community where you have to deal with people's sinfulness, and you have to deal with a variety of people, you know, and so I guess I just would, you know, because that's a challenge of being vulnerable with people and being open and being honest and dealing with different types of people. You know, you even see this in church communities where, particularly in the Catholic tradition, I see this where, you know, it's like, well, that's a conservative church and that's a liberal church. And then it's like, you know, people don't interact with people. They don't struggle. It's like, well, everybody at the church does it, you know, and it's more in terms of like the practices, you know, oh, well, that's the church where, you know, they have Latin mass, or that's the church where they have traditional music, and that's the church where they do all the guitar music or whatever. And they're the progressive church or whatever. And it's like, all churches should have a variety of people from different backgrounds working together and trying to address this. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a bit of what I find concerning, because I think, yeah, I mean, you just see that, like, and if communities don't have like strong spaces like churches or community groups that bring people together across a variety, I think it's further leading to more polarization, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know if you feel the same in terms of like, because you do a lot of community activism, but I've just found that a lot, you know, younger people are less willing to like get involved in different community projects if it's like, well, I'm not going to agree with this person or that person, or
right.
Yeah,
I think you're making a good point that just where people are, there's going to be issues as far as like there's no perfect community. And like it's funny because I had a friend who was going to basically a secular church, for lack of better words. It was just a group that met on Sunday mornings, same kind of rhythm as a church service, like is you know, there's coffee, bagels, you know, but then they had different speakers every week and they talk about different social issues and stuff. And I only visited like one time and I was like, oh, this seems like a really cool group. And like, but there was no prayer, there was no there was not there wasn't any like, you know, religious aspect to it. And then we like went and got lunch afterwards, and we're talking, and she's telling me all this drama that's going on in this non-church church. And I'm just like, oh, okay. So yeah, if it was a Christian church or not, like you just realize people are people and people are going to people.
Right, exactly. And institutions are going to have power imbalance and people struggling for power and corruption happening and abuse. And so it's not to say like, let's just ignore that, but it's more to say, that these are challenges that need to be addressed. Yeah.
There's a author, his name's Peter Rollins, and I haven't read his stuff in a long time, but he's kind of just a modern day kind of Christian philosopher, and he talked about how his kind of thought was the best form of a church or any kind of faith group like model that he thinks everyone should take is basically like around similar to an AA meeting where people are together and being deep and vulnerable to where, you know, it's a safe space and basically like admit like, hey, I'm broken and there's broken things in me. And I don't know. I also, like I said, I try to change my mindset. Like I grew up very much like, I'm a worm and I'm unworthy and I don't deserve
right.
God's love.
Yeah,
and so
there's a bit of that can be too much. Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah.
I try to like, but I take that nugget of what he's trying to share and say is like more coming from this place of deep vulnerability.
Right.
That,
right.
Hey, I don't have my shit together. And I'm here to express that with people who also don't have their shit together. And
I see that with young people too. Like there's a lack of like wanting to be vulnerable with people, like in relationships. People are very, they want everything to be perfect. And
I've done the Bumble dating. I know exactly what you're talking about. They're like, oh, you seem fun, but this other guy's got this other more perfect body. Or they have the right pickup line. I don't know. Yeah, it's like there's always an option, a carousel of
exactly. Yeah, no, totally. And you need diversity in a church community too. Like oftentimes people say, well, this is a great church because it's all young people, and it's like, well, maybe that isn't the best thing. Like maybe you need a community that has a range of people of different generations, that are sharing different issues and problems, and you can learn from each other, Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, there's so much, and I appreciate what you're saying. Like I'm 33, so I'm only like just now kind of dealing with this like internal old man syndrome where I'm like get around like early 20 somethings and I'm just kind of like, oh yeah, you guys don't know what the fuck you're doing, I don't know.
No, I know, teach a bunch of 20-year-olds. And
it's just funny because I realize like, oh, one day I'm gonna be that boomer, for lack of better words. One day I will be that person that everyone's giving me crap for because I won't go get the chip installed in my brain, the this and that, and like, no, back in my day we just went on regular dates and virtual stuff. I did want to ask you something because this is your area of expertise in digital media studies, and like you said, this is a whole new field of looking at how people are forming like these religious kind of connections and spiritual connections with people all virtually. So what do you think of the metaverse? And what do you think that next generation of homo techno like?
I'm gonna answer in a really maybe a snarky way, but it's so funny because go back 20 years and there's all this literature about Second Life and religion. And I feel like it's the same thing. Like, I don't see how it's much different, but I mean, there's a lot of stuff about that, about how people would have like Buddhist meditation circles in Second Life, and, they would recreate churches in Second Life. I don't know. I'm
sorry,
always...
what does Second Life mean?
Oh, see, it's funny. You don't even know what Second Life is. It's the metaverse, basically. It still exists.
Oh, okay.
It's like a program where you go on, you have like an avatar, you create, and people can create different spaces. So like they would recreate like Westminster Abbey, for example, and you could go there in Second Life. And there's quite a lot about Buddhism in Second Life. I'm not sure why, but like there's an entire like Buddhist monastery you can go to and meditate, and and a lot of the stuff with that is that people create like an avatar, and it's like, often it's like a more beautiful version of them or this kind of idealistic version of who they are. But I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical that it's going to really take off, just because it never took off really before. Like Second Life was never really became that popular. And I think it's because it's so distinct from, like, there's a kind of a uncanniness to it that I think a bit turns people off, because it's like, you're not really quite you, but you're sort of you. And so I'm not sure like if it will become a big thing, but I'm curious to see. I have a student in my class this semester who's really interested in the metaverse and religion in the metaverse. And I understand that there are quite a few places you can go to that are religious on there. But I think, I'm a little skeptical of whether it's going to be a huge thing, but I'm not sure. What do you think? Do you think people will get into it?
Oh yeah. I think for sure the human imagination really, really seeks to detach and to find solace in the other worlds or the other realms, kind of thing. And like, people, it's funny, just go back 100 some years ago, like people would be shitting on you for always being the book reader because you're not living in the real world.
Yeah.
You're detaching yourself by this kind of, you know, transposing your mind kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
And so you're right. I think to some level, there's only so far it can go before you're like, okay, I don't know. But I have seen some crazy videos where like there's this guy on TikTok or something that like he has made it a goal to try, like he has a job in the metaverse and literally tries, like he has like a little place where he like showers, never takes his goggles off. Like he like tries to live in the metaverse all the time. And you know how you can do that and try to eat, or you know, it just, there's so much to it. You know, that's maybe more extreme versions of that. But I think for sure that the more folks who find community online and can maybe, I think where they can, I think probably the next evolution of it will be, like I said, there's something crazy that happens from a physiological level when you are in a group spiritual space, when you're in like, yeah, again, like I've been to a Buddhist like meditation
the embodiment
circle,
of it.
Right. And there's always going to be a little bit of that gap when you're just wearing some goggles. But the more you're wearing things, and I don't know, like if Elon Musk and them make this Neuralink and 50 years from now, you can like have this weird, you know, similar kind of chemical release as if you were doing like physical body impairment with people. I could see how it would be something that people would gravitate towards more because they are getting that chemical fix. They're getting that spiritual experience. And they might feel like this is not the real world. I don't want to live in this one. This is my community is over, it's out there, you know. But I don't know. Maybe.
Well, two thoughts. One is that I think there always has been, there always will be people for various reasons who need those spaces to gather. So it could be people who have disabilities or you know, whatever it might be, like not having the ability or maybe mental health to go into these spaces in real life. So there's always been from the beginning, Heidi Campbell, who's kind of one of the key figures in media digital religion. I mean, she started off looking at online message boards, like religious message boards. So from the very beginning of digital media, there was religion there, right? So I think there is always people that are going to be in those spaces and doing religious things and spiritual things in those spaces. And then I think you're definitely right that there is this escape thing. I mean, you look at, you know, going to a movie or art or whatever it might be and escaping. I guess I'm just skeptical that I just feel like most people they might want to escape, but they don't necessarily want to be that engaged in that space in a way. Like it's kind of like when you go to a movie, you just watch the movie and you can escape inside your mind, but nobody's like watching you perform that, right? Whereas I feel like if you go into the metaverse, you're maybe escaping, but you're also kind of performing too. I don't know if that makes sense.
For sure.
It's much more active, but I just think there is a bit of a kind of, like I said, this uncanniness to those spaces that is a little bit hard for a lot of people to bridge. That I think people like this idea that in social media, it's like kind of you, it's like a better version of you, but it's not this like uncanny space. It still is familiar and human. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying, because until we can make it so lifelike and realistic, because the same thing, I think they were talking, I saw something that, again, whatever the thing was, you know, who knows, it could have been TikTok, whatever it was. But the same thing was kind of like developing like these very realistic looking robots. Like it was actually more unsettling. Yeah, that's why like Elon Musk and them are making like these just actual, just like their face is just a screen with like a little smiley face, like convey like, you know, basically the simplest of human emotions, but you keep that distance. Like this is robot thing and this is real life, because the more you try to simulate a real existing person, the more uncanny and kind of like the more unrest you feel towards that thing.
It's the Polar Express thing. Do you remember that movie?
Yeah. Everyone's like, I don't want to watch this movie. It's like realistic looking cartoons. I don't like this, you know?
Exactly.
Like animation.
Yeah. So, yeah.
I find all this, super fascinating. Just, where the future world's going to come. And I feel like that's why I'm like, even though I live in this world, I do digital, I do marketing communications. It's like, I just see myself as I age, I will probably become more and more of a Luddite, or I'll just like, okay, I don't need to adopt every new technology that comes out, and eventually just kind of whatever people might call it devolve, or I don't know, downgrade, but suddenly I'm a hermit and living in the woods and just want to do with my plants,
Exactly. No, I'm telling you, go back and read 2005 or so. There's several Second Life religion books.
Wow. I have to look into that. Well, Kristin, thanks for being with me and sharing about your book and your thoughts on just digital activism. And
sure. It was good to chat.
Bring all these faith constructs together, hopefully unify around common causes of uplifting our fellow humans. And where can folks, listeners, find you online?
I have a website. It's my name, KristinMPeterson.com. You can look at me up at Boston College. And I'm on Twitter at ChrissyPD. And you can find me there and post different things. And check out the book, Unruly Souls. It's at Rutgers University Press, but you can get it, anywhere books are sold.
Yes, definitely. Well, again, appreciate you being here, and folks, until next time.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Micah.
Thanks for joining me for the Pray for Micah podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review, and check out my YouTube channel and follow me on social media. Pray for Micah Pod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. We'll see you next time.
You are now re-entering the normal world.